Samuel Carver had a habit of counting things that mattered. Cords of firewood stacked against a cabin wall, days left before the first hard freeze. The number of fresh graves in the settlement cemetery come April, after a Montana winter had finished saying what it had to say. He counted these things the way a practical man counts bullets, before a long ride into uncertain country, not out of morbidity, but out of the bone-deep understanding that in this territory, the distance between alive and dead was measured in careful arithmetic. So on the evening of November the 9th, 1867, standing on the porch of Morrison's trading post, with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand, Samuel Carver counted the smoke columns rising from the cabins scattered across the Teton River Valley, and when he reached the ridge to the northwest, he stopped. There was no smoke above Eric Lindqvist's cabin. The temperature had already dropped to -22. The sky above the rocky mountain front was the color of a gun barrel, low and pressing, the kind of sky that old men in the valley recognized the way they recognized the smell of a wound going bad. Something worse was coming. Everyone in the valley knew it. Every chimney in sight was working hard, sending thick columns of pale smoke straight up into the dead still air. Every chimney except one. Carver stared at the ridgeline for a long moment, then pulled his ledger from his coat pocket. He had a page near the back where he kept the names of the men who'd placed bets on how long the Swede would last. He did not add anything. He just looked at the page, then looked back at the ridge, then went inside and said nothing about it to anyone. He had been watching that ridge for 6 weeks. It had started in late September when Dale Harmon came into the trading post and described what he'd seen on the road north of the Teton crossing. Dale was a man constitutionally incapable of keeping anything to himself, which made him the most efficient information distribution system in the valley, though the information he distributed was rarely improved by the journey. He'd been riding back from checking a fence line when he saw Eric Lindqvist on the creek bank half a mile below his cabin, loading granite boulders into a hand sledge. Not unusual perhaps, except that Dale had passed that way 3 days before and seen Eric doing the same thing. And 3 days before that as well. The man was hauling rocks, not timber, not sod, not anything that made sense to a person preparing for winter in northern Montana. Rocks. By the time the story made its third or fourth circuit of the trading post, the details had arranged themselves into something that invited ridicule, which in a frontier settlement in the autumn of 1867 was essentially an invitation to entertainment. Men who spent their days in back-breaking labor and their nights fighting exhaustion had limited appetite for complexity and considerable appetite for a story that let them feel for a moment smarter than someone else. Eric Lindqvist hauling rocks instead of splitting firewood was that kind of story. The bets followed naturally. Morrison himself, the trading post proprietor, a heavy-set man from Ohio who'd come west with ambitions that had gradually compressed themselves into the management of a store and an opinion on everything, wrote the amounts down in a ledger that was separate from his accounts, because even he understood that there was something unseemly about profiting from a man's probable death, but not so unseemly that he wouldn't do it. Carver had not placed a bet. He had watched and counted and said very little. Eric Lindqvist had come to the Teton River Valley in the spring of 1864, 41 years old, with a single blade axe, a Sharps rifle, a canvas bag of tools that clinked and rattled against his hip, when he walked in a quality of stillness that some men read as stupidity and others read as something more difficult to name. He was not a large man, but he was the kind of man who took up the right amount of space, no more, no less, and who moved through difficult work with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing difficult work since before he had opinions about it. He spoke English without an accent, which surprised people who expected otherwise from a man with a name like his, and he had a precise, observational quality to his speech, choosing words the way a carpenter chooses a joint for fit, not decoration. He had grown up in Duluth on the western shore of Lake Superior, the second son of Swedish immigrants who had arrived in Minnesota in 1840 and spent the next 2 decades building a life out of timber and stubbornness. His father had worked the lakeshore as a ship's carpenter, and Eric had worked alongside him from the age of 9, learning the particular discipline of a trade that could not afford mistakes. A bad joint in a lake freighter didn't fail quietly. It failed catastrophically in cold water, far from shore. That education gave him a way of thinking about problems that was less interested in whether a solution sounded reasonable and more interested in whether it would hold under maximum stress. His grandfather had taught him something different and in some ways more important. The old man had arrived in Minnesota with nothing but his language and a set of skills acquired over decades of building masonry heaters in the homes of people who lived where winter was not an inconvenience, but a genuine attempt by the natural world to kill you. He built these heaters the way he had learned to build them: dense stone cores, serpentine heat paths, systems designed to absorb and hold thermal energy rather than simply produce it and lose it. He spent his last years in a small house in Duluth, and in that house he had built in the back room a stone stove of his own design that heated the entire structure from a single modest fire each morning. Eric had grown up placing his hands on the warm floor of that back room on February mornings, watching his grandfather light a small fire, feed it for 2 hours, then let it go cold, and understanding, even as a child, that what he was witnessing was not a trick but a principle, something as true and reliable as the way water ran downhill. Stone remembers fire, the old man told him once in English that still carried the full weight of another language underneath it. People forget. Iron forgets. Stone never does. Eric had carried that sentence west with him like a tool he hadn't yet found the right use for. His first winter in Montana had been educational, in the way that near-death experiences are educational. The lessons arrived with absolute clarity and total disregard for the student's comfort. He'd built his cabin on a rise overlooking the valley, a location other settlers had looked at and passed by, because it was exposed a half-mile from the nearest tree line, open to winds that came off the Rocky Mountain front, with the concentrated hostility of something that had been gathering speed for 1,000 miles. Eric had chosen it deliberately. The view was unobstructed in every direction, which meant he could see weather coming from a long way off. The soil was deep and well-drained. The creek was a manageable distance below, and he had even then a reason for choosing open ground over shelter that he hadn't yet fully articulated to himself. What he had not yet accounted for was the thermal reality of a Montana winter inside a cabin with a cast iron stove as its only defense. The stove he'd bought from Morrison's had a firebox the size of a bushel basket and a draw that could consume a split log in 20 minutes when it was running hot. It produced, when properly fueled, a substantial and immediate heat that radiated from the iron in waves you could feel on your face from 6 feet away. It was also, Eric came to understand in those first weeks of his first winter, a machine for converting wood into warmth and then immediately losing that warmth the moment the wood was gone. The iron held heat poorly. The cabin walls held heat poorly. The floor, which was frozen ground covered by a layer of rough sawn planking, held heat not at all. It was a cold sink drawing warmth downward all night and returning nothing. The result was a system that required constant feeding to maintain any livable temperature, and that collapsed to near freezing within an hour of the last log, which meant waking every 90 minutes through the night in a cabin where the temperature between the stove and the far wall could differ by 40 degrees. He'd survived that first winter. He'd also, in the last week of January, lost feeling in 2 fingers of his left hand for 11 days and had watched his water bucket, left what he judged was a safe distance from the stove, freeze solid by morning for 5 consecutive nights. He'd burned through 4.5 cords of firewood, which he had barely managed to cut and split in the time available before freeze-up, and he'd spent the last 2 weeks of February rationing with a precision that left no margin for error. In March, when the temperature lifted enough that he could sit outside during the warmest part of the afternoon without his breath freezing in his beard, he opened the small notebook he used for measurements and observations, a habit from his years doing ship carpentry, where the difference between a dimension recorded and a dimension guessed could mean a hull leak, and he began to write down everything he knew about how heat moved and how it was lost and what he would have to change. The notebook filled slowly over the following year and a half. He was not a man who wrote quickly or carelessly. What emerged from those pages was not a plan exactly, but a kind of problem-solving conversation with himself full of false starts and crossed-out calculations and small drawings of pipe configurations that he revised and revised again. He drew on the principles his grandfather had shown him in Duluth. He applied the mechanical understanding he'd developed building things that had to hold under real-world stress. He thought about the creek bed below his cabin, where granite boulders the size of a man's head lay in the shallows by the thousands, and he thought about the thermal properties of dense stone, and he thought about what it would mean to move the heat out of the air, where it was constantly escaping, and into the ground beneath his feet, where it had nowhere to go. By the autumn of 1866, the idea was complete enough in his mind that he had begun to price it in terms of labor. By the following spring, he had begun to feel the specific urgency of a man who knows what needs to be done and has not yet started doing it. By September of 1867, Eric Lindqvist was ready to find out if 3 years of thinking are worth anything at all. He told no one the full plan. This was partly temperament. He was a man who believed that work should speak for itself and that words spent on intentions were words wasted, but it was also tactical. He had lived in this valley long enough to understand that an idea described before it was demonstrated was an idea that invited interference, and the interference of well-meaning neighbors on a frontier could be as damaging as the indifference of hostile ones. So when Owen Harmon saw him loading stones onto the hand sledge for the third morning in a row and rode over to ask what he was building, Eric told him he was reinforcing the foundation and fixing the floor. Not a lie exactly, a compression. Owen looked at the stones, looked at Eric, and nodded with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to reserve judgment, but has not in fact reserved it. Dale Harmon had no such restraint, which is why the story reached Morrison's trading post before the week was out. The work was not dramatic in the way that frontier stories are sometimes told to be. It did not compress into a single image of heroic labor against a beautiful landscape. It was 43 days of the same motion repeated until the body stopped registering it as effort and started registering it as simply what the body did now. He woke before first light, walked the half-mile to the creek bed, selected stones by hand, feeling their weight, checking for the kind of fine surface cracks that indicated hidden moisture pockets, rejecting perhaps 1 in 4, loaded them onto the sledge, and hauled them up the slope to the cabin. The sledge held perhaps 300 pounds at a time, and he made the round trip anywhere from 4 to 8 times a day, depending on the terrain and his own accumulating fatigue. His hands blistered in the first week, toughened in the second, and by the third week had developed a layer of callus so complete that he could grip rough granite without sensation. His lower back developed a specific complaint that arrived every morning at the same point in the first uphill haul and remained for the rest of the day, not sharp enough to stop him, but constant enough to be its own kind of company. He logged the stone tonnage each evening in his notebook alongside the temperature and the hours worked. The numbers grew slowly. The pile beside the cabin grew slowly. The neighbors' opinions hardened at approximately the same pace. He'd built the subfloor frame from cottonwood logs, notched and fitted with the care of someone who understood that the weight above it would eventually reach 4 tons, and that the frame's failure would be total, not gradual. The frame ran the full length of the cabin, 18 feet by 24, 3 feet deep, a void beneath the planking that he'd intended from the beginning of the construction to fill with heat-holding mass. He packed the stones in layers largest at the bottom, progressively smaller, above, working toward maximum surface area and minimum air gap. Between layers, he packed sand hauled from a gravel bar 3 miles down the creek, filling the interstices so that heat could not move through the bed without first moving through stone. The pipe system had required the most thought and the most revision. He'd salvaged iron pipe from an abandoned mining operation to the south, 2 trips with a borrowed wagon 40 miles each way, and a debt to Owen Harmon, who'd lent the wagon without asking too many questions. He'd bent and fitted the pipe sections into a serpentine path through the stone bed designed so that hot exhaust gases from the stove would travel at minimum 30 feet through the rock mass before reaching the external vent. The physics were straightforward. The longer the gas was in contact with the stone, the more of its thermal energy it surrendered before leaving the system. The goal was to bring the exhaust temperature down to near ambient by the time it reached the exterior, which would mean the stone had absorbed nearly everything the fire had to give. He installed cleanout ports at 4 points along the pipe run, knowing that creosote accumulation was not a possibility but a certainty, and that blocked pipes meant smoke backup, and that smoke backup in a sealed cabin in a Montana winter was one of the ways a man was found in spring when the drifts pulled back. These ports were not an afterthought. They were in his notebook, described in more detail than almost any other component, because he understood that the maintenance requirements of a system were as important as its initial performance, and that a solution people couldn't service would eventually fail in the worst possible way. Everything was proceeding according to his calculations, with the tolerances he'd expected when he decided to run the first heat test. It was the 3rd week of October. The frame was packed, the pipes were fitted, the external vent emerged from the north wall of the cabin, 6 inches above ground level, a detail that had caused more head scratching among the few visitors who'd seen it than almost anything else about the project. "Where's your chimney, Eric?" He'd smiled and told them to wait. He connected the stove to the descending pipe, checked the joints one last time, with the thoroughness of someone who had once watched a lake freighter take on water through a seam that had seemed perfectly adequate on land, and fired the stove. For the first 40 minutes, everything worked as expected. He could feel the heat moving through the floor. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a faint change in the temperature of the planks beneath his boots, the earliest possible signal that the stone below was beginning to absorb. He sat on the floor with his notebook and recorded temperatures at 10-minute intervals. The stove was running hot and clean. The draw was strong. The exhaust, when he checked it at the external vent, was moving well. Then the sound began. It was not loud at first. A series of small, sharp cracks from beneath the floor were irregular, like green wood settling in a fire. He noted it in his notebook and continued recording temperatures. Then the cracks increased in frequency, and something changed in their quality, a deeper resonance that vibrated up through the floor planking, and before he had fully processed what that change meant, the floor lurched beneath him as though struck from below by something heavy, and the sound became a sound he recognized immediately and with complete clarity, the sound of stone under pressure failing catastrophically. He pulled up the nearest access plank and looked down into the stone bed. 3 of the boulders he'd pulled from the creek shallows had split along internal fracture lines. He hadn't been able to see fractures that had been filled with moisture that had now, under heat, converted to steam faster than the stone could accommodate. One of the split stones had shifted the pipe section above it out of alignment by nearly 2 inches. He could smell the exhaust changing direction inside the cavity, looking for a new path. Given another hour, it would find one, and that path would be up through the floor rather than out through the vent. He put the fire out. He sat on the edge of the open access panel in the cooling cabin and looked at what the first real test of his system had produced, and he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in 43 days of hauling stone, a specific quiet despair that was less about the failure itself and more about what the failure revealed. He had selected those creek stones by feel and observation, and his feel and observation had been wrong in at least 3 instances, which meant they might have been wrong in others, which meant the entire bed needed to come out and be rebuilt, this time with stones that had been dried completely before installation, or with the moisture driven out slowly over days of gradual heat before the system was brought to operating temperature. He opened his notebook and wrote in the steady, unemotional hand of someone who had learned that emotion wasted time. Day 31. Wrong. Start over. It took him 4 days to remove the affected stones, assess the rest, and identify 7 additional boulders that showed the fine surface texturing he now understood indicated moisture content. He removed them all. He reheated the remaining stones slowly over the 2 days. Not the aggressive first fire test, but a careful graduated process, watching and listening at each temperature increment, giving any residual moisture time to escape as vapor rather than steam. None of the remaining stones failed. He added replacement stones he'd selected from a drier section of the creek bank, tested those in isolation before integrating them, and rebuilt the affected section of the pipe assembly. He told no one any of this, not because he was ashamed of the failure. Failure was information, and information was what you needed to build something that actually held, but because the failure was now corrected, and the corrected version was what mattered. In the ledger of things worth communicating, a problem that had already been solved ranked below almost everything else. What stayed with him, though, and what he added to his notebook in small, careful writing beneath the Day 31 entry, was a note about the nature of the creekstone test. If that failure had occurred not during a cautious first test, but during an actual winter storm, if he had been running the system hard for 3 weeks and the stones had failed under thermal stress in the middle of a -40 night, the consequences would have been categorically different. The pipe misalignment would have sent exhaust into the stone bed cavity. The cavity's connection to the interior of the cabin was not airtight. He would have been asleep. He wrote the note not to frighten himself, but to recognize that the margin of error in what he was building was not abstract. It was real, and it was specific, and it had a direction, and the direction was there was no second chance. By the 28th of October, with the first serious snow dusting the valley floor, the system was complete. He ran a 7-day gradual heat-up sequence, bringing the stone bed's temperature up in increments, checking the exhaust temperature at the external vent each morning and evening, logging everything. On day 4, he ran his hand along the floor planking and felt for the first time not just the absence of cold, but the actual presence of warmth, gentle, even rising from below with a quality completely unlike the sharp, radiant heat of the iron stove. It moved through his palm and up his arm, and he sat on the floor for a long time in the October dark, with his hand flat on the wood, feeling something that was technically a temperature differential, and was also, in a way he didn't try to describe in the notebook, a kind of proof. Owen Harmon came by that week to return a splitting maul he'd borrowed. He found Eric outside cutting a modest amount of wood, not the enormous stacks his neighbors were building against the cabin walls, but a workmanlike pile of modest dimensions. Owen stood looking at it for a moment, then looked at Eric with the expression of a man running calculations in his head. "That's not enough wood for winter," his voice carrying the flat informational quality of someone stating a surveying result rather than offering an opinion. Eric set the maul down and looked at the pile. "It's enough for what I'm doing." Owen waited. Eric didn't add anything. Owen rode away with the information and no clear idea what to do with it. The Harmon brothers were in the taxonomy of the valley's settlers, the most useful kind of neighbor, the kind who noticed things without immediately converting their noticing into noise. Owen, the older by 4 years, ran the ranch with a methodical precision that had kept them solvent through 3 hard years when several of their neighbors had failed. He watched Eric's project with the sustained attention of someone who hadn't decided what it meant yet. Dale, who was the operational inverse of his brother in almost every communicable way, had been the primary vector through which information about Eric's stone hauling had reached the trading post, and would remain the primary vector for whatever happened next, which was in its way a useful thing to understand about the valley's information infrastructure. Samuel Carver had heard every version of the story that passed through Morrison's, and had formed over the 6 weeks of watching an opinion he hadn't shared with anyone. He was a man who had been on the Montana frontier long enough to have seen both kinds of unconventional ideas, the kind that got a man killed, and the kind that very occasionally changed how everyone else lived. The ratio was heavily weighted toward the first kind. The frontier selected hard against experimentation for the simple reason that a failed experiment in this country didn't produce a lesson, it produced a body. But Carver had also been around long enough to know that the conventional way of doing something and the best way of doing something were not always the same thing, and that the men who'd been here longest were sometimes the least equipped to see the difference because they'd survived by doing it the known way and couldn't afford to imagine that survival might be possible another way. He'd watched Eric's woodpile. He'd watched the smoke or the absence of it from the cabin on the ridge. He'd run his own arithmetic, which told him that a man heating a cabin through a Montana winter with what Eric had cut was either planning to freeze or planning something he hadn't accounted for yet. The 9th of November brought the barometric signal that the old-timers read as clearly as a written warning, a pressure drop so fast and deep that it had a physical quality, a weight change in the air that you felt in your ears and your bad joints before you saw it in any instrument. The sky had been darkening from the northwest for 2 days, but the 9th was when the darkness took on the specific opaque quality of a system that was not going to pass over but was going to stay. Morrison had it from a trapper who'd come down from the high country. That morning, the temperature at elevation had dropped 43 degrees in 18 hours. That was not a storm. That was a reckoning. By afternoon, men were bringing livestock in from distant pastures. Children were kept inside. The last of the exposed water sources were identified and protected. The social grammar of the valley contracted overnight to the cabin and survival scale, the mode it would hold for however long the system lasted. Morrison estimated 3 days. The trapper estimated 5. No one in the valley had good enough experience with what was coming to estimate confidently, which was itself a kind of data. At dusk on the 9th, Carver saddled his horse and rode north. He did not fully understand why he was doing it. He had not placed a bet. He had not been among the men who called Eric simple or speculated about the date of his probable death. He was a man who kept his opinions inside his coat until there was a reason to bring them out. and he had never found a sufficient reason in 6 weeks of watching to say anything to Eric Lindqvist about rocks and pipes and the approaching winter. But dusk on the 9th of November, with the barometer still falling and the sky doing what it was doing to the northwest, felt like the last possible window for a certain kind of conversation. Eric was splitting the last of his modest woodpile when Carver rode into the yard. The light was failing fast. The temperature was already dropping through the negative teens, and the first wind was beginning to move in the grass at the edge of the property. Eric looked up from the block, set the maul, and waited. Carver pulled up and looked at the cabin, then at the woodpile, then at the sky, then at Eric. The inventory of a practical man, accounting for everything he was seeing and finding the total concerning. He leaned forward in the saddle, and the thing he said came out more directly than he'd intended, stripped of the careful neutrality he usually maintained. Lindqvist, pack what you need and come to my place. Bring the rifle. Leave the rest. Eric picked up the split sections from the ground and stacked them with the unhurried precision he brought to every physical task. He looked at the sky to the northwest, which was now doing something that even he recognized as requiring respect. He looked back at Carver. The pause between them was long enough to make Carver's horse shift its weight. Then Eric's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the facial equivalent of a man who has placed a very large bet and is now in the last moments before the outcome is decided, and who has enough confidence in his calculation to find the situation interesting rather than terrifying. I'll be fine. His voice was quiet, but there was a quality in it that Carver would remember later, not defiance and not the bravado of someone who hadn't fully thought through what they were walking into. Something more like the steadiness of a man who has already been to the edge of the question and come back with an answer and is now simply waiting for the world to confirm what he already knows. Carver sat on his horse in the darkening yard for a moment longer. He looked at the cabin door, at the external vent pipe emerging from the north wall, at the modest woodpile that was never going to be sufficient by any calculation he knew how to do. He looked at Eric, who had turned back to his splitting and was working with the quiet, complete attention of someone who had already closed the conversation and moved on to the next task. He rode back down the ridge in the last gray light of the evening, with the wind beginning to pick up behind him and the sound of the axe following him down the slope, steady and unhurried, until it was swallowed by the distance and the noise of the coming weather. He did not add anything to the ledger page when he got back to Morrison's. He sat at the table near the stove and drank his coffee and looked at the northwest wall of the building, which was beginning to flex slightly against the wind, and thought about what it meant that a man could look at that sky and say, "I'll be fine," with that particular quality of certainty. Either Eric Lindqvist had made a mistake that would cost him everything, or he had built something in those 6 weeks that none of them had the framework to evaluate yet. The temperature was -26 when Carver finally went to bed. He did not sleep well. Through the night, he heard the stove in the trading post working steadily, consuming wood at the rate it always consumed wood, efficient as a machine that had been designed to solve a problem that might, if a Swedish-American with a notebook and a mind like a ship's carpenter had done him what Carver thought he might have done already, have a better solution. By morning, the world outside was white and moving, and the temperature had fallen another 16 degrees, and the valley had closed itself down to the serious businesses of surviving what was coming. And on the ridge to the northwest, Eric Lindqvist's cabin stood exposed to the full fury of the Rocky Mountain front, with no windbreak, no natural protection, and no smoke rising from any chimney, because there was no chimney to raise smoke from. There was only the stone and the heat it was holding, and the man who had bet everything on the principle his grandfather had first pressed into his hands on the warm floor of a Duluth back room 30 years before. The world was about to vote on whether he was right. The storm arrived without the theatrical buildup that lesser weather used as a prelude. It simply came, a wall of pressure and cold and moving white that descended on the Teton River Valley in the pre-dawn hours of November 12th, like a hand closing around something small and fragile, testing the grip. The temperature at first light was -31. By 9 in the morning, it had fallen to -38. The wind, which had been building through the night from the northwest, hit the valley floor at sustained speeds that made the air itself feel structural, a moving wall rather than a medium, something that pushed back with intention. Eric had been awake since 5. Not from cold, the stone bed had been running for 22 days of continuous gradual heating, and the floor planking radiated a low, persistent warmth that made the cabin feel, even at first light on the worst morning of the year, less like a space being defended against the outside and more like a space that had simply insulated itself from the outside's opinion. He had made coffee on the stove, which he'd kept burning through the previous night, at a rate calculated to deliver maximum heat to the stone without burning through his wood supply faster than the math required. He'd checked the temperatures at 3 points on the floor surface, a habit he'd developed over the past week using a technique borrowed from his ship carpentry days, pressing a strip of lead against the wood and measuring its deformation rate as a proxy for surface temperature. The numbers were consistent with his projections. The stone below was holding approximately what he'd calculated it should hold. At 10 in the morning, with the wind loading the north wall of the cabin, hard enough to move the hanging tools above the workbench, Eric stoked the stove to its highest operating temperature, feeding it the best split, driest hardwood in his pile, running it red hot for 2 hours. This was the final charge, the last deliberate addition of thermal energy to the stone bed before the test began. He watched the exhaust temperature at the external vent with the close attention of a man reading a gauge that his life was connected to, and the numbers moved as predicted. The exhaust came out barely warmer than the ambient air outside, which meant the stone was absorbing nearly everything the fire had to give. At noon, with the wind screaming around the cabin's corners in a register that seemed to want to be heard as a warning, Eric let the fire go. He did not let it go dramatically. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply stopped feeding it. He sat in the chair beside the stove and read, and the fire diminished at the rate fire diminishes when it is no longer fed, dropping from flame to coals to a fading orange glow that asked, in the particular silent language of dying fires, for one more piece of wood. He gave it nothing. By 1:30, the firebox held ash and the lingering ghost of heat that cast iron produces for perhaps 40 minutes after the last coal dies. By 2 o'clock, the stove was cold. Eric cleaned the firebox completely, removing the ash into a metal bucket, and set the bucket outside the door. The cabin held no burning material of any kind. He took the temperature of the floor in 3 places, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The outside temperature at that moment, according to the thermometer mounted on the north exterior wall, was -41. The differential was 104 degrees, maintained by stone and nothing else. He ate a cold meal, hardtack dried venison, a piece of hard cheese, because cooking required fire, and he had decided that the first night would be the clearest test, the night with no confounding heat source, no coals, no lamp heat beyond the single oil lamp he allowed himself for reading. He recorded everything in the notebook. Then at 8 o'clock in the evening, with the storm fully arrived and operating at its declared intention, Eric Lindqvist lay down on his bunk in his wool undershirt, pulled the blanket up, not from necessity, but from habit, and closed his eyes. The wind found every angle of the cabin and tested each one. The walls flexed slightly under gusts that hit 40 miles an hour and then exceeded that. The single window on the south wall vibrated in its frame with a sound like a distant drum. These were not small sounds. They were the sounds of a structure being systematically interrogated by a force that had no preference about the outcome, and they would have been in any other cabin in the valley, accompanied by the close orange warmth of a fire being fed and the particular anxious alertness of a man counting his wood supply against the unknown duration of the storm. Eric was asleep by 8:30. 3 miles southeast, Owen Harmon was feeding his stove for the second time in 2 hours. The cabin he shared with his brother was well built by frontier standards, tight-chinked, double-walled on the windward side, with a firebox large enough to take 4-foot sections. They had 7 cords stacked inside and against the sheltered south wall, which Owen had calculated was sufficient for a 10-day storm. He was recalculating. The wind was pulling heat out of the structure faster than he'd expected, and the stove was having to work at a rate that would exhaust his indoor supply in 6 days rather than 10 if this continued. He stood at the firebox with his hand on the handle and looked at his wood stack in the lamplight, and felt the specific anxiety of a man who has prepared correctly for the wrong conditions. Dale was asleep on the far bunk, which was pushed as close to the stove as fire safety allowed, and even there his face visible above the blanket line showed the particular shrunken quality of someone sleeping in a cold that has penetrated the room's perimeter and is moving steadily toward the center. Owen put 2 more logs in the box, adjusted the draft, and went back to his bunk, knowing he would be up again in 90 minutes. In a cabin half a mile closer to the trading post, Thomas and Clara Porter were engaged in the silent, exhausted economy of frontier winter survival with a 3-year-old. Their daughter Ruth had developed a cough 2 days before the storm arrived. Not dangerous yet, but the kind of cough that required warmth to stay not dangerous, the kind that a sustained cold spell could convert into something with a different prognosis. Clara had their largest pot on the stove boiling water for steam, a remedy for the congestion that required constant fire and constant water and constant attention. And Thomas was managing all three, while Clara held the child near the steam with the careful, vigilant focus of a parent doing the only thing available to do. Their wood supply was healthy. Thomas had cut generous and stacked tight, but the stove in their cabin ran small, and the small stove was working at its upper limit, and the upper limit was not quite enough to hold the room temperature at the level that made Clara feel comfortable about Ruth's breathing. Thomas opened the firebox to add wood, and the handle caught wrong in his numb fingers, and the log dropped, and the corner of it kicked a coal the size of a walnut onto the wooden floor. He had it smothered with his boot in under 3 seconds, but the 3 seconds after that, the check, the assessment, the look at the blackened floor plank carried the full weight of what fire in a frontier cabin meant. And he stood there longer than the situation required, his heart doing something in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Samuel Carver lay in his bunk at Morrison's in his coat and 2 wool sweaters, and thought about the ledger page with the names on it, and thought about the fact that he had ridden out to the ridge on the 9th and come back with more questions than he'd brought, and thought about the absence of smoke he'd noted above Eric's cabin in the days before the storm, and could not sleep. The trading post was the best-built structure in the valley, and it was cold enough inside that his breath was visible when he checked the time on the wall clock at midnight and found that it was not yet midnight, and lay back down with a particular dissatisfaction of a man who is both exhausted and too alert to benefit from it. What he could not stop turning over was the quality of Eric's voice when he'd said, "I'll be fine." In 40 years of living among working men, first in Ohio, then in Indiana, then in 3 territories as the frontier moved and he moved with it, Carver had developed a reasonably calibrated ear for the difference between confidence that was earned and confidence that was performed. The second kind was common and loud and usually accompanied by the kind of outcome that generated names and ledgers. The first kind was quiet and rare, and generally correct. Eric's voice on the ridge at dusk had not been performing anything. It had the quality of a man reporting a fact about a fixed and stable thing, and that quality would not leave Carver alone no matter how many times he went over it in the dark. At 3 in the morning, Eric woke up. It was not the cold that woke him. The temperature in the cabin had dropped as he'd expected, from 63 to 60 degrees, a change so gradual it registered in his sleep as nothing more significant than the kind of minor environmental shift the sleeping body accommodates without urgency. What woke him was a sound, not a loud sound, a quality of sound that his ship carpenter's training had developed a specific sensitivity to the sound of a mechanical system working against a slight misalignment, the faint vibrational signature of something under pressure that was not quite running true. He lay still for 30 seconds, parsing it. The wind was the dominant sound, still enormous, still working the cabin with sustained force. But beneath the wind there was something else, a faint resonant hum coming from below the floor. From the pipe system, a note that was fractionally different from the normal acoustic signature he'd learned over 3 weeks of monitoring the system. He placed his hand flat on the floor planking. The warmth was there, but he could feel very faintly a vibration in the wood that had not been there when he fell asleep. He was on his feet and pulling up the access panel before he had consciously decided to do it. The lamp was the wrong light for what he needed too. Directional, too localized, but it was what he had. He lowered it into the cavity above the stone bed and looked at the pipe section closest to the external vent, which was the most likely point of problem given the geometry of the system. The pipe was in position, the joints were holding, but the exhaust draft had changed quality. He could feel it now against his hand, a slight irregularity in the flow, a pulse where there should have been a constant. He followed the pipe length with the lamp, moving it slowly along the run, and found it at the 3rd joint from the vent end. Snow loading on the external vent cap had partially compressed the outlet, reducing its cross-section by roughly 1/3. The reduced opening was creating back pressure through the pipe run. Not enough to reverse the flow. Not yet. But at the current rate of drift, And with the storm outside still building, rather than easing within 2 to 3 hours, the pressure differential would cross a threshold and exhaust gases would find the path of least resistance, which was back into the stone bed cavity, which was not airtight with respect to the cabin interior. He put on his coat, his boots, his gloves, and he opened the cabin door. The storm hit him like something physical and intentional. The temperature outside was -43, and the wind was running at better than 40 miles per hour. And the combination of those two facts at the moment of door opening produced a cold so complete and penetrating that it was less like stepping into air and more like stepping into another medium entirely. One that moved in the body differently than air that found the gaps in the coat and the gloves with a kind of systematic thoroughness. He kept one hand on the cabin wall and moved around to the north face where the vent pipe emerged 6 inches above the current snow level. The snow level had risen. The drift loading on the vent cap had pressed it down to roughly a 60% open position. He cleared it with his gloved hand, packing the snow away from the cap, restoring the opening. The wind immediately began working to rebuild the drift. He took a coil of wire from his coat pocket. He had not planned this, but he had in the way that careful men prepare a collection of materials on his person and in his coat's deep pockets that were available for unforeseen requirements, and fashioned a crude standoff frame around the vent cap that would hold the drift back from direct contact with the opening. It was not elegant. In the daylight and calm conditions, he would have built it better. In -43 with 40-mile winds and one hand already losing fine motor function, despite the gloves, it was sufficient. He got back inside, pulled the door closed against the wind's opinion about that, and stood in the cabin breathing hard, while the warmth from the floor began working on the cold he'd absorbed in 4 minutes outside. His hands were shaking, but functional. He checked the pipe system again, through the access panel, waited 20 minutes, checked the exhaust draft quality. The irregularity was gone. The system was running true. He wrote in the notebook by lamplight, his hands steadier than it had been 5 minutes before near failure. Vent loading from snowdrift, cleared and braced. Less an external vent cap, requires drift protection in storm conditions. Modified design for future installations. He looked at the entry for a moment, then added, below it, if this had happened at 5 in the morning instead of 3, the outcome would have been different. He did not elaborate on what different meant. He didn't need to. He closed the notebook and went back to bed. The second day of the storm was worse than the first in the particular way that sustained bad weather is worse than initial bad weather. Not necessarily more extreme in any single measurement, but relentless in a way that erodes the psychological resource you didn't realize you'd been spending. The wind did not diminish. The temperature did not rise. The sky outside the south window was the absolute white of complete occlusion, a white with no depth or gradation, the visual equivalent of silence. He cooked for the first time since the storm began, a modest fire 2 hours enough to heat water and prepare a meal and add a marginal increment of energy to the stone bed below. The floor temperature had dropped from 60 to 58 degrees overnight. The 2-hour cooking fire brought it back to 61. He logged this. The arithmetic was encouraging. A 2-hour fire each day was more than sufficient to maintain the system at operating temperature. He had wood for 19 days of 2-hour fires. The storm was not going to outlast his supply. He read. He sharpened 2 tools that didn't need sharpening because the discipline of physical work, even unnecessary physical work, helped him think. He reviewed his notebook from the beginning, not just the current winter's entries, but the full record going back to the first winter. The Coalfinger winter. The winter that had started the whole project, and he experienced the particular satisfaction of watching a problem that had once been a set of questions gradually become a set of answers. The notebook contained both the questions in the early pages wide and searching full of the uncertainty of a man who doesn't know yet what he doesn't know, and the answers in the later pages precise and tested and arrived at through failures that are noted with the same calm handwriting as the successes. He found between the sections a page from a different era, a leaf of heavier paper folded twice written in a different hand, his grandfather's handwriting. The old man had in his last year written down a set of observations about masonry heating that Eric had asked him to record because the old man's memory was beginning to fail in ways that made his spoken knowledge unreliable. The writing was in English laboriously formed with the letter shapes of someone who had learned a second alphabet late in life. It described the thermal properties of different stone types, the importance of pipe length relative to stone mass, the relationship between fire duration and heat retention. It was not a scientific document. It was an experienced man's field notes written for a grandson who was listening before he fully understood what he was listening to. Eric read it through once, then again, then folded it carefully and placed it back where it had been for years. He understood something now that he hadn't fully understood when the old man was alive, that what he had built beneath his floor was not an innovation exactly, not in the sense that implied no one had known this before. The principle was old. The stone heaters his grandfather had described and built in Duluth were working versions of the same idea. What Eric had done was carry the idea into a place where it hadn't arrived yet and recognize that the conditions here, the extreme cold, the remoteness from fuel, the vulnerability of the frontier, made the idea not just useful but potentially critical in a way it had never been before. He was not an inventor. He was a translator carrying forward what had been known somewhere else and showing what it could mean somewhere new. That understanding did not diminish anything. If anything, it clarified the obligation. If the principle worked here the way it had worked in Duluth, then keeping it to himself was not an option. The knowledge was not his to keep. On the second evening, Owen Harmon made his 7th trip to the woodpile in 36 hours. He had moved the indoor wood supply against the east wall rather than the traditional position near the stove, partly because it was more efficient, and partly because being forced to walk across the cold floor to get each load reminded him physically and repeatedly of how much wood was going in. The number was not small. He was burning at a rate that had begun to feel like bleeding sustainable for a while, but with a direction that concerned him. Dale had developed a cough that morning, a dry cabin cough from air that was too hot near the stove and too cold 2 feet away, and he was sleeping badly, which meant Owen was effectively running the fire alone. The third day brought a brief reduction in wind speed that was not an improvement in any meaningful sense. It merely changed the texture of the cold from bludgeoning to pervasive, settling the temperature down to -47 in the early afternoon and staying there. Owen looked out through the south window of the Harmon cabin and saw the ridge to the northwest, Eric's Ridge, as a white suggestion through the blowing snow. He had been thinking about that ridge since the first day of the storm. He had been thinking about the woodpile he'd seen, about the exchange he'd had, about whether it was enough, about the answer that hadn't answered the question. On the third afternoon, during the brief reduction in wind, Owen put on his heaviest gear and went out to check the cattle in the south barn. The work took 40 minutes. On the way back to the cabin, he stopped. He wasn't sure why initially the route didn't take him to a vantage point for the northern ridge, and there was no practical reason to look that direction. But he stopped in the yard with the wind reduced to a manageable push and looked northwest, and what he saw made him stand completely still for a full 30 seconds in the cold. The ridge was visible. The outline of Eric's cabin was visible on it. And above the cabin, above the roof line, above the full structure, there was no smoke. There was no column, no drift, no evidence of combustion of any kind. To Owen's eye, standing in his yard on the third day of a storm that had driven every other structure in the valley to its most intensive fuel consumption, Eric Lindqvist's cabin appeared to have no heat source operating. He stood in the wind and looked at this fact and felt something shift in his understanding of the past 6 weeks. Not an arrival at a conclusion. He didn't have enough information for a conclusion. But the kind of internal reorientation that happens when a piece of data arrives that is inconsistent with the entire framework you've been using to interpret a situation, and when your options are to reject the data or revise the framework, and when the data is standing right there in front of you, refusing to be rejected. He went back inside, fed the stove, sat down, and said nothing to Dale. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. Not gradually, it released the way severe weather in that country sometimes released, with an abruptness that felt almost like a correction, as though the natural world had concluded its argument and saw no reason to continue making it. The wind dropped to nothing in under an hour. The sky cleared from the west with the speed of drawn curtains. The temperature remained extreme -32 at mid-morning, but the absence of wind changed the quality of the cold from lethal to merely serious, and the valley began the slow, difficult process of emerging from 5 days of enforced stasis. Owen Harmon was outside before the sky had fully cleared. He needed to check the cattle. He needed to assess the barn roof's drift loading. He needed to do half a dozen things that 5 days of confinement had backed up into an urgent queue. He did all of them in sequence, and when the most urgent items were handled, he stood in the yard and looked at the northwest ridge and made a decision. He found Dale inside, still coughing, wrapped in two coats near the stove. "I'm going to check on Lindqvist." Dale looked up with the slightly disoriented expression of someone whose sleep had been fractured for 5 nights. "You think he made it?" Owen pulled on his outer coat and didn't answer the question, which was itself an answer of a kind. He went to the trading post first because the path took him past it, and because he wanted company for what he expected to find, and because if what he expected to find was in fact what was there would need to be decisions made about how to respond that were easier to make with another person present. Carver was already up and dressed, standing at the post's front window looking northwest. He turned when Owen came in, and they looked at each other with the particular economy of two men who are thinking the same thing and don't need to spend words getting there. They found two other men from the plane at the post, both having come in to check conditions and discuss the recovery work ahead. The four of them set out together, two on horses, two on foot in the track. The horses broke, moving through chest-high drifts in places, making a pace that was slow and deliberate, and accompanied by the particular silence of men on a mission they haven't fully articulated to each other. The ridge took them 40 minutes to reach. The drift on the north face of the cabin was extraordinary. It had built up over 5 days of unobstructed wind loading to a height that covered the lower third of the north wall and buried the external vent completely. Carver noted this. He noted also that the south face was largely clear and that the door, when they reached it, showed no ice seepage at the threshold of the kind that formed when interior warmth was insufficient to prevent the ambient cold from penetrating the bottom seal. The threshold was dry. Owen knocked. The door opened. Eric Lindqvist stood in his doorway in a wool shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. His hair was uncombed. He was holding a coffee cup. Behind him, the interior of the cabin was visible, and what was visible inside registered in the minds of the four men standing in the cold with the force of something that required a second look, and then a third before the information it carried could be adequately processed. The floor was dry, not damp cold dry the way floors were in frontier cabins in winter when the ground cold worked up through inadequate insulation. Warm dry, the dry of a space that had been at a consistent, comfortable temperature for long enough that moisture had no foothold anywhere. The windows on the south wall showed condensation on the interior glass, which meant the air inside was warm enough to sustain water vapor. The stove visible from the doorway was cold, completely cold. No ember, no warmth, no indication that it had been used at any point in the recent past. And the floor itself, the plank floor, the surface of it showed in its coloration and in the faint visible ripple of the air immediately above it the unmistakable signature of something that was warm, not from above, but from below. Carver stepped inside first because Carver was the kind of man who moved toward things that required understanding rather than away from them. He walked to the center of the cabin. He looked at the stove. He looked at the floor. He looked at Eric with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from the careful neutrality he'd maintained for 6 weeks and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of genuine, undefended astonishment. Then he crouched down, removed his right glove, and pressed his bare palm flat against the floor planking. The warmth moved into his hand immediately. Not faint warmth, not the residual temperature you might expect in a well-insulated space. Real warmth, the warmth of a surface that was actively giving up heat to whatever touched it, steady and patient, and coming from below. He held his hand there for a long moment. Owen, who had been standing in the doorway, stepped inside and crouched beside Carver and put his own hand on the floor without being asked. The silence in the cabin lasted long enough to have weight. It was Carver who spoke. He was still crouching, still pressing his palm against the warm planking, looking up at Eric with an expression that contained both the intelligence to recognize what he was experiencing and the honesty to admit what it cost him to recognize it. "How are you not frozen solid?" His voice carried no hostility, only the stripped-back directness of a man who has been wrong about something important and knows it and wants now to understand how. Eric set his coffee down on the table, pulled up the access panel in the floor nearest the stove, and showed them the stone. He lifted it out slowly, that plank, and what was underneath was not mysterious. It was granite-packed stone, unremarkable in any individual specimen, remarkable only in its scale and its arrangement, in the temperature it was carrying 5 days after the last fire that had heated it. He took Carver's hand and moved it to the surface of the uppermost stone layer. The granite was warm to the touch, warm with a depth and persistence that iron, however hot, never achieved, because iron gave up its heat quickly and completely, while stone gave it up the way it gave up everything slowly and on its own terms. Eric opened the notebook on the table. 22 days of entries, temperature readings taken 3 times daily, stone bed surface, temperature, cabin, air temperature, outdoor temperature, wood consumed hours of fire. He turned to the page for November 12th and pointed to the noon entry, which showed cabin floor temperature at 63 degrees and the notation fire out. Test begins. He turned to the November 16th entry and showed cabin floor temperature at 57 degrees, 4 days of storm, -40 temperatures, no fire, and the floor had dropped 6 degrees. Carver read the entries in order. He read them the way a man reads a document he expected to contain one thing and has discovered it contains something else entirely. When he reached the entry for 3 in the morning on the 13th, the vent clearing, the near failure, the wire brace, the notation about what different would have meant, he stopped and looked up at Eric, and something crossed his face that was not quite any single emotion, but was the combination of several arriving simultaneously. "How much wood did you burn?" His voice had dropped from the formal, careful tone of a man monitoring his own reactions to the flat register of genuine inquiry. Eric moved to the window, lifted the edge of the curtain, and indicated the wood pile on the south side. He had started with 1.25 cords. He had burned perhaps 1/4 cord in 22 days of gradual preheating and 5 days of minimal cooking fires. He would end the winter with more than 1 cord remaining. Carver stood up. He was a man who had, in 40 years of frontier life, developed a deep respect for the cost of survival, the physical cost, the wood cost, the sleep cost, the body cost of waking every 90 minutes through every winter night for as many winters as a man managed to have. He had paid that cost himself, and he had watched others pay it, and he had understood it to be simply the price, non-negotiable, fix the thing you paid to be here. And now he was standing in a cabin that had survived the worst storm of the year, with a cold stove and a floor that was warm, and a woodpile that was still largely intact, and the man who had built it was standing across the room in his shirt sleeves at noon on the 16th of November. Carver looked at Eric for a long moment. When he spoke, the words arrived with the weight of a man who does not give acknowledgement casually and is giving it now because the ledger requires it. "I owe you an apology and I owe you an explanation, and they're the same thing. I took bets on how long you'd last. I didn't place one, but I held the ledger." Eric looked at him with the expression of a man who already knew this and had no particular grievance about it. "I know." He picked up his coffee cup and handed it to Carver, who took it without thinking and held the warm cup and understood in the way that small gestures sometimes carry the full weight of what words can only approximate that the accounting was settled. Owen Harmon was still crouching on the floor with both hands on the planking, his eyes moving from the stone, visible through the access panel, to the cold stove, to the warm boards beneath his palms, running the arithmetic that a man who managed a ranch ran automatically: labor hours, material costs, fuel savings, risk reduction, the compound math of what a system like this meant over a single winter and then over 10 winters. His brother was inside with a cough that had cost 5 nights of sleep. They had burned through half their wood in 5 days. Next winter was 11 months away, which was also almost no time at all. When he finally stood up and turned to face Eric, his voice carried the particular quality of a man making a decision in real time. "I want to build one. Tell me what I need to know." Owen Harmon was a man who began things before the conditions were ideal, because in his experience the conditions were never ideal, and waiting for them was how a man ran out of time. He started building his stone bed in March of 1868, while the ground was still frozen hard enough that the creek stones had to be chipped free from the bank, rather than lifted. Eric worked alongside him on the first 3 days, teaching not through instruction precisely, but through demonstration, the way a craftsman teaches, by doing the thing correctly in front of someone who is watching closely and trusting them to absorb the why through the observation of the how. Owen watched and absorbed. By the 4th day, he was working without guidance, asking questions only when the situation he was facing had no analog in what he'd already seen. Dale was a different kind of learner. Dale needed to talk through what he was doing, needed to narrate the process as a way of confirming his own understanding, and he was consequently the mechanism through which the technical specifics of Eric's system spread through the valley at a pace that no deliberate instruction program could have matched. He explained it to every person he encountered from February through June of 1868, sometimes accurately, sometimes with embellishments that Dale Harmon's mind added to every story it carried, but always with the core principles intact. Stone holds heat. The longer the exhaust path, the more heat surrendered to the mass. Depth is not optional. The ratio of stone to cabin volume is fixed by physics and cannot be argued with. He said this last part with the authority of a man who had not personally tested the physics, but had watched his brother test them, which he considered close enough. 7 families broke ground on stone bed installations before the spring thaw was complete. Eric visited each site at least once, sometimes twice, moving through the valley, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that his work was now primarily about transfer, rather than creation, getting the knowledge from inside his head and his notebook and into the hands of people who would carry it forward in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. He did not charge for his time. When the question of payment came up, as it did with several of the families, his answer was consistent enough that it became eventually a kind of shorthand for the man himself. Build it right and show someone else how. The first significant failure arrived in the form of James McCready, who was 29 years old, newly married, recently settled on a quarter section east of the trading post, and possessed of the specific confidence of a young man who has watched an expert demonstrate something and concluded that the demonstration has fully communicated the thing. McCready built his stone bed in 6 days, which was approximately half the time the work required if the work was to be done correctly. He used creek stone without the graduated heat treatment that drove out trapped moisture. He built the bed to a depth of 18 inches rather than 36, reasoning that half the depth would provide half the benefit, and half the benefit of Eric's system was considerably better than no benefit at all. His pipe run was 21 feet rather than 30, because 21 feet was what his available salvaged pipe could manage without additional sourcing, and additional sourcing required time and money. And McCready had made a private calculation that the pipe run length was probably the most forgiving variable in the system. It was not. The first cold snap of the following autumn revealed the results of each of these compressions simultaneously. The stone bed held heat for approximately 5 hours after the fire went out, longer than a conventional stove by a meaningful margin, but nowhere near the 18 to 24 hours that a correctly built system provided. The moisture in the creek stones created pressure differentials inside the bed that produced cracking sounds through the night, unsettling enough that McCready's wife Clara refused to sleep on the floor above them during the worst of it. McCready stoked his fire through the night at nearly the same rate as his previous winter, which was exactly what he had built the system to avoid, and he did this while sleeping on a floor that occasionally produced sounds like distant rifle shots from the stones below. He came to Morrison's trading post on a Thursday in November, pulled up a chair across from Samuel Carver, and made his displeasure known with the compressed anger of a man who has invested significant labor in something that has not performed as advertised. Lindqvist's system doesn't work, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a verdict rather than a complaint. I built it like he said, and it's no better than what I had. Carver, who by this point had spent 10 months watching Eric's system operate at close enough range to have formed a detailed technical opinion, did not respond to the emotional content of this statement. He asked 3 questions. How deep was the bed? What was the pipe run length? Had the creek stones been heat treated before installation? McCready answered in sequence, and with each answer, Carver's expression shifted incrementally towards something that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. You didn't build Lindqvist's system. Carver's voice even and informational. You built a smaller, faster version of it. Those are different things. He stood up, collected his coat, and told McCready he'd send word to Eric. Eric came within 2 days. He did not come with the bearing of someone who has been vindicated by another person's failure, which would have been the easier and more human response. He came with his notebook and his measuring tools and the same quality of focused, practical attention he brought to every physical problem, which treated the failure as information rather than outcome. He spent 4 hours at the McCready property measuring testing, identifying each departure from the correct specification and its thermal consequence. He showed McCready the calculations not to humiliate, but to demonstrate that the specifications were not arbitrary, that each dimension had a reason grounded in physics, and that the physics had been considerably less forgiving of compromise than McCready's initial estimate had assumed. Then he offered to help rebuild it, not redesign it, not patch it, rebuild it from the stone layer up correctly with properly treated stone, adequate depth, full pipe run, length. The work would take 3 weeks. Eric would do half of it himself. McCready looked at him for a long time. He was not a man who accepted help easily, particularly from someone who had just demonstrated with careful arithmetic the precise dimensions of his mistake. But he was also not a man who could afford another winter of the system he had. All right, his voice quiet, the single word carrying the full weight of what it cost him to say it. The rebuilt system ran correctly from its first winter. McCready never made another adjustment to it. He also, beginning in the spring of 1869, became the most persistent and detailed communicator of the system's technical requirements in the entire valley. The man who stopped anyone he heard discussing a stone bed installation and asked the 3 questions Carver had asked him, and who could explain in specific terms what happened when the answers were wrong, because he had lived the answer. His failure had become through the peculiar alchemy of a man who refuses to waste an experience the most effective instructional tool in the valley's growing body of practical knowledge. By the autumn of 1870, some version of Eric's system was operating in 43 structures across the Teton River Valley and the country east and south of it. A blacksmith in Helena had developed a standardized pipe fitting that made the serpentine runs easier to assemble. A carpenter in Virginia City had designed a modular access panel system that simplified maintenance. The principle was spreading faster than Eric could personally oversee it, which was the point in which he regarded with satisfaction, but also with the awareness that each installation he had no visibility into was an installation that might repeat McCready's errors without McCready's corrective experience. This concern was not abstract. The winter of 1871 opened hard and early, and by mid-October was already indicating that something worse was organizing itself in the weather patterns to the north. The old-timers read the signs with the resigned familiarity of people who recognized a particular kind of bad from having survived it before. The hay crop had been poor, a dry summer followed by an early frost that had killed the second cutting. Game had moved earlier than usual, the deer and elk pushing south and into the high timber in response to signals that the human residents of the valley were still processing as abstraction, while the animals were already responding to as fact. Eric spent the autumn of 1871 differently than he had spent any previous autumn. He hunted more than he had before, and he hunted with the systematic intentionality of someone building a supply rather than meeting a need. He had spent previous autumns with adequate time for hunting because the stone bed system required so little wood preparation compared to conventional heating, and this accumulated time dividend had been building for 4 years. He used it now. He dried and stored venison and elk and hung ducks by the dozen from the cold side of the north wall. He laid in flour and cornmeal and dried beans at a level that Morrison's Trading Post Register would later show was nearly twice his usual order. He could not have told you exactly why, except that he had been keeping a record of weather patterns in his notebook since his first winter, and the current autumn's numbers compared against that record produced a result that made him want more of everything. He was right, but he did not know yet how right. The winter of 1871 to 72 arrived in December with the character of something that had been patient for a long time and was no longer interested in patience. The temperature fell to -50 in the second week of January and stayed there for 11 consecutive days, which was a duration that exceeded the previous record in the valley by 6 days. The game had been gone since November. Travel on horseback became genuinely life-threatening above 20 minutes of exposure, which meant that the normal fabric of mutual support that frontier communities maintained through winter contracted to nearly nothing. Each household closed around itself like a fist managing its own resources against an unknown duration. The Porter family ran out of wood on January the 14th. Thomas Porter had built a stone bed installation in the spring of 1869 using Eric's full specifications correctly executed, and the system had performed well through 2 winters. But the installation had been sized for his original one-room cabin, and in the spring of 1870, he had added a room for storage and eventual use as a sleeping space for Ruth, now 6 years old. The addition increased the cabin's volume by 30%. He had known this would require adjustment to the stone bed system and had planned to extend it the following spring. The following spring had arrived full of other urgent work, and the extension had been deferred. Now, the original stone bed was being asked to heat a space a third larger than it had been designed for in temperatures that exceeded anything in its operating history, and it was doing so with the stoic persistence of a system that was working as hard as it could while falling short of what was needed. The wood ran out not because Thomas had cut insufficiently, but because the undersized stone bed was demanding supplemental heat at a rate that consumed his supply faster than he'd projected. He burned his furniture before he would burn the walls, and then he burned what he could take from the storage addition without compromising the structure's stability. And by January 14th, he had nothing left that would burn, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped to 38 degrees, and Ruth had developed the cough that Clara had been afraid of since October. Eric found out through the specific mechanism by which critical information traveled in a valley locked down by extreme cold. Owen Harmon's cattle operation required twice daily barn checks regardless of temperature, and Owen's route between the barn and the cabin passed a vantage point from which the Porter property was visible. And on the morning of the 14th, Owen saw no smoke above the Porter roof. Owen was by now a man who understood exactly what that meant. He got to Eric's cabin in 40 minutes on the horse he kept saddled for emergencies, riding with his face covered and his hands inside his coat. He told Eric what he'd seen and the time it took to get off the horse and get through the door and close it. Eric was already moving before Owen finished the sentence. What happened next was not heroic in the way that frontier stories sometimes required heroism to be loud dramatic performed against a backdrop of visible suffering and sudden salvation. It was the quieter heroism of a 50-year-old man with a bad back, methodically loading a hand sledge in negative 50 degrees with the supplies he'd been accumulating since October, taking inventory in his head against what he knew about each of the 3 households he intended to reach. He took venison, cornmeal, dried beans, a sealed container of rendered lard. He took a coil of pipe wire and 2 spare pipe fittings of the keys most commonly used in valley installations, because a family whose stone bed had failed under thermal stress was a family whose pipe system might also be compromised. He took his notebook with the installation specifications because if a system needed emergency repair in these conditions, he would need to work from memory, supported by reference rather than from memory alone. Owen offered to come. Eric looked at him with the expression of a man doing a calculation that had a clear answer. You have cattle that die without you. I don't. Owen didn't argue. He helped load the sledge and watched Eric move north into the white. The cold at negative 50 had a quality distinct from the cold at negative 42 or negative 38 that Eric had experienced in previous winters. It did not feel like more of the same thing. It felt like a different thing, a cold with structural properties, a cold that behaved less like temperature and more like material that moved differently in the lungs and produced a particular sensation in the exposed skin of the forehead that was closer to pressure than to sensation. He kept his face covered except for the eyes, and he moved at a steady pace that was fast enough to generate body heat and slow enough to be maintained for the 2 hours the journey required. He did not let himself think about the temperature. He thought about the sledge weight and the snow surface and the route and the 3 houses at the end of it, because thinking about those things was productive and thinking about the temperature was not. He reached the Porter cabin first because it was closest and because Ruth's cough was the most urgent variable in his inventory. He heard the cough before he knocked a deep, resonant sound with the wet quality that lived on the wrong side of the line between a cold and something worse. Clara opened the door, and the expression on her face when she saw who was standing in the yard with a loaded sledge moved through several registers in rapid sequence, ending somewhere that had no clean name, but that Eric recognized as the specific relief of a parent who has been afraid for their child and has just been given a reason to be less afraid. The stone bed in the Porter cabin had not failed. It had maintained 38 degrees in a space 30% larger than its design capacity in negative 50 temperatures for 3 days without a fire. That was Eric noted in his notebook while Clara fed Ruth heated broth from the provisions he'd brought, a demonstration of what the system could do under conditions that exceeded its specifications. He checked the pipe run while Thomas rebuilt the fire, found one section with moderate creosote accumulation that he cleaned in 20 minutes and restored the system to full operation. The floor temperature read 42 degrees when he put his hand to it. In 2 hours, it would be above 50. In 6, it would be above 60. He spent 45 minutes at the Porter cabin, which was as long as the other two families could afford. Thomas walked him to the door and held it, and what he tried to say came out compressed into something smaller than what he meant by it, which was the common condition of frontier men trying to find words for large things, my daughter. He couldn't finish it. Eric put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a contact so brief and undemonstrative that it barely qualified as a gesture, and yet it communicated the full thing, that it was enough, that this was what the valley was for, that the wood and the venison were already forgotten on both sides, and what remained was only the fact of a 6-year-old girl who was going to be warm tonight. He picked up the sledge and moved north. The second family, the Donahues, had a stone bed installed correctly, and their crisis was food rather than heat. A miscalculation about winter duration combined with 3 months of below-average game had left them on half rations since the 1st of January. The father, Patrick, was 44 and physically compromised by the reduced caloric intake in a way that his wife, Margaret, had been masking in her reports to neighbors since November. Not from pride exactly, but from the specific frontier psychology that treated the admission of vulnerability as a step toward the kind of help you couldn't always rely on receiving. She opened the door when Eric knocked and looked at the sledge, and then looked at Eric with the same expression Clara Porter had shown, and Eric understood from it that the situation was worse than Owen had described. He left half of his remaining food stores. Patrick was on his feet by the time Eric left, moving slowly but with purpose, feeding the stove while Margaret organized the provisions with the systematic care of someone who has recently learned at some cost not to take supply for granted. The third family was the Wellers' recent arrivals, 18 months in the valley stone bed unbuilt. They were the reason this situation was what it was. No thermal mass, no stored heat, no margin. Their cabin was the coldest of the three, and the youngest child, a boy of 4 named Henry, had been sharing his parents' body heat for 2 nights because the air in his corner of the cabin had dropped below the temperature at which a small body could maintain itself without assistance. Eric rebuilt their fire from the modest remaining wood supply with the systematic urgency of someone triaging, producing the fastest safe temperature rise. The firebox could manage, then sat with the family for an hour while the cabin climbed towards survivable and made notes about what a stone bed installation would require in this specific structure when the spring came and the ground was workable again. He made a promise to the Wellers that he came back in March before the frost was fully out and began the installation himself. They worked alongside him and learned as they went in the manner Eric had developed over the previous 3 years of teaching, not lecture, not demonstration, but shared labor, in which the students' hands did the actual work while the teachers' hands were available for correction. By April, the Wellers had a functioning stone bed and a working understanding of how to maintain it, and Henry, who was old enough to be curious about what lived under the floor, pressed his palm against the warm planking every morning with the reliable fascination of a child who has not yet lost the capacity to be astonished by the physical world. Samuel Carver spent the starvation winter at Morrison's trading post, managing the community's collective resource situation with the ledger-keeping discipline that was his principal skill and his primary contribution to the valley's survival infrastructure. He tracked wood supplies, food stocks, the health status of the families. He had information about the animals lost to cold and feed shortage. In February, when the worst of the temperature had moderated enough to allow horse travel, for more than 20 minutes, he rode north to check on Eric and found him at the Wellers' property marking stone placement for the spring installation. Carver watched him work for a few minutes from the yard before announcing himself, and what he was watching produced in him a slow, accumulating thought that had been organizing itself since November of 1867 and was now 4 years later finally arriving at a form clear enough to act on. He had in his possession a record, not the notebook that was Eric's and had always been Eric's, but Carver had, in the course of his tracking and coordination work, accumulated a set of observations about the stone bed systems in the valley, their performance during the starvation winter, the differences between correctly and incorrectly built installations, the specific failure modes that the winter had revealed, the material quantities and labor requirements that he'd gathered in conversation with the families who'd built them. He had also the story itself, the autumn of 1867, the bets in the ledger, the storm, the warm floor, the cold stove. He was a man who understood that the story was part of the information, that a technical description without the demonstration was less persuasive than the same description with the demonstration attached. He asked Eric on that February afternoon if he had any objection to Carver writing it down. Not the notebook, a pamphlet, something that could be printed at the Bozeman Press and distributed to the settlers who were arriving in increasing numbers, the families who were making their land decisions before they had any knowledge of how to build efficiently for where they were going. Eric looked at him for a moment with the expression he used when evaluating a piece of information for its accuracy rather than its intent, and then said that he had no objection, but that he wanted to read it before it went to the press. He spent 3 weeks writing it. He was not a man who had written for distribution before, and the first draft was too long and too technical in some places and not technical enough in others, and he revised it 4 times before he gave it to Eric. Eric read it sitting at the table in Carver's quarters at the trading post, moving through it page by page with the focused attention he brought to his own notebook entries. And when he was done, he made corrections to 5 numerical specifications that Carver had slightly misremembered, and he added 2 sentences to the section on stone selection that covered the moisture content problem, because leaving that out would have produced McCrady's error in the hands of every independent builder who read the pamphlet. And then he found the section that Carver had written about the origin of the system, the part that described it as Eric Lindqvist's innovation, Eric Lindqvist's invention, and he crossed out the attribution with 3 clean lines and wrote above it in his measured, consistent hand, "This method was taught to me by my grandfather, who brought the principle from his own father. I carried it here. Anyone who builds this correctly is continuing in something old, not starting something new." Carver looked at the correction for a long time. Then he said it as the pamphlet's opening paragraph. The press in Bozeman ran 400 copies in the spring of 1872. Carver priced them at 10 cents, which covered printing, and left 2 cents per copy for the Post's general fund. The pamphlets moved faster than he had expected. By June, the initial run was exhausted, and he'd ordered a second printing of 600. By autumn of that year, copies had reached the Dakotas, Wyoming, Colorado, and were reportedly circulating in parts of Nebraska, carried by travelers and traders, and the particular informal mail system of the frontier, which operated on the principle that useful information found its own distribution network. The pamphlet's opening paragraph, the one Eric had written over Carver's original attribution, was quoted in a Helena newspaper in the winter of 1873 in an article about frontier building practices, and the newspaper's editor added a note beneath the quote that said simply, "The man who says this about his own work is the man whose work is worth listening to." Carver cut the article out and kept it in the same ledger where he'd once kept the names of the men who'd bet on Eric's death. He did not show it to Eric. He kept it because it was accurate and because accuracy in his experience deserved to be preserved. In the spring of 1873, a woman arrived at Morrison's trading post with 2 children and a letter of inquiry about available quarter sections in the valley. She was 34 years old, a widow out of Wisconsin, and she had in her possession a copy of Carver's pamphlet that she had acquired through a land agent in Minneapolis, who had been distributing them to prospective settlers as a practical guide to heating costs and construction requirements in the Northern Territories. Her name was Ingrid Halverson, and the first question she asked Carver when she came through the door before asking about land prices or school arrangements or any of the things that a woman with 2 children in a new territory might reasonably ask first was whether the stone bed method described in the pamphlet could be built into a structure that was already framed or only into new construction. Carver looked at her for a moment, then smiled the rare, unguarded smile of a man who is encountering unexpectedly someone who has done their homework. He told her he'd introduce her to the man who could answer that question better than anyone in the territory. She and Eric met in April over a site assessment for her property, and what Eric registered about Ingrid Halverson in that first meeting was not what a man typically registered about a woman he'd just met. What he registered was the quality of her attention. She watched what he was doing with the same focused, observational precision he used himself, and when she asked questions, they were the questions of someone who was building a functional understanding rather than seeking reassurance. She wanted to know the thermal calculations for a structure of her dimensions. She wanted to know the correct stone sourcing for the soil type on her property. She took notes. Her notes he saw when she turned the page were organized with a logical structure that was different from his but equally systematic. He helped her build the stone bed installation over 3 weeks in May. Her children, a boy of 9 named Anders and a girl of 7 named Sonia helped carry the smaller stones under a supervision arrangement that treated them as workers rather than passengers, which they responded to with the reliable enthusiasm of children, given real tasks and real stakes. The installation was completed correctly and on schedule. Eric's back hurt for a week afterward, which it did now with most sustained labor, and he noted in his notebook that summer in the driest possible terms, 50 years old and feeling it. He and Ingrid were married in the spring of 1879, 6 years after the site assessment. The courtship, if that was the right word for what happened between two self-sufficient people in their 40s, who had been neighbors and collaborators and occasional dinner companions across several winters, was less a romantic progression than a gradual acknowledgement of a conclusion that had been building for some time. It required eventually someone saying the thing that the evidence had been pointing toward for at least 2 years, and it was Ingrid who said it with the directness of a woman who had learned that indirection cost time she didn't have. We're both doing the same thing separately that we could do better together. Eric looked at her across the table and understood that she was not speaking metaphorically and that she was correct on every dimension. The statement could be read and said so. And that was essentially that. She told friends later when the story came up, as it occasionally did among the women of the valley, that the warm floor had been part of the attraction. She had spent 2 winters in a Wisconsin farmhouse heated by a single cast iron stove, and the memory of those winters waking in coats. The water in the wash basin skinned with ice. The sustained physical exhaustion of fighting cold with insufficient tools made her regard a warm floor, the way a person who has gone hungry regards a full pantry, not as a luxury, but as a fundamental shift in the quality of what was possible. But she also said, and she said this with the precision of a woman who chose her words carefully, the floor was why I wanted the cabin. The man was why I stayed. The years that followed were not without their losses. Eric's back declined incrementally, requiring modifications to his work habits that he made without complaint, but that the notebook recorded honestly. Tasks delegated, distances shortened, the speed of physical work reduced by stages to something that was slower but no less precise. 2 children came to the marriage, born in 1881 and 1883, and the cabin on the ridge absorbed them with the ease of a structure that had been built with more capacity than its original occupant required, as though Eric had known in the choosing of that exposed ridgeline location that he was building for more than himself. Samuel Carver died in 1887 at 64 from a chest illness that arrived in October and declined to leave. He had run Morrison's trading post for 23 years and had in that time served as the Valley's de facto accountant, mediator, information broker, and institutional continuity. He left no family in the Valley. What he left was a ledger, not the one with the names of the men who'd bet on Eric's death, though that was there too, but a second ledger that he'd kept separately from the trading post accounts, a record of stone bed installations he'd tracked since 1868, addresses, builders, specifications, first winter performance, subsequent modifications. 87 entries by the time he died, each one annotated in his spare accountant's hand. He left the ledger to Eric. The pamphlet by that point had gone through 7 printings and been reproduced without attribution in 3 agricultural and homesteading guides published east of the Mississippi. Eric knew about the reproductions because a copy of one of the guides had found its way to the Valley through a new settler's book collection, and Ingrid had found it and brought it to him one evening with the expression of a woman who expects a particular reaction and is prepared to find it more complicated than the reaction a simpler man would have. Eric read the relevant section, which had reproduced the technical specifications accurately, and the opening paragraph not at all had stripped the attribution to the grandfather, had made it simply method rather than inheritance. And he put the guide down and looked at the fire for a moment and said what the moment seemed to require. The stone doesn't care who gets credit for the warmth. The last entry in Eric's notebook was made in November of 1901. His handwriting by then showed the accumulated evidence of 56 years of physical labor and the arthritis that had been advancing through his hands since his late 60s, not illegible but no longer the precise, consistent script of the earlier entries. He had by that point been making entries in the same systematic format for 37 years: date, temperature, floor temperature, wood-burned observations. The last entry departed from this format. It was simply this: I have been warm when the world was cold. I have shown others how. The stone was always here waiting. I only asked it to remember. He died in January of 1902 at 79 in the cabin on the ridge, warmth of the floor his grandfather had taught him to build, and his own hands had built, and his family would continue to inhabit for another half-century. Ingrid survived him by 11 years. Their children and their children's children maintained the property with the particular care of people who understood that what they were living in was not just a cabin, but a demonstration, a proof still running of something that had once seemed impossible. The Helena Independence obituary noted the heating system and added a reflection that no one had tried to quantify before: the hours of unbroken sleep over 35 years in every cabin running a correctly built stone bed system that had previously been spent waking to feed fires. The editor, who preferred concrete images over abstract statistics, declined to convert this to a single large number, and instead wrote, "Every man in this territory who has slept through a winter night without rising to feed his stove has Eric Lindqvist to thank for that sleep." It is the quietest legacy we know of, and perhaps the most important one. The cabin stood through the territorial years, in the statehood years, in 2 world wars, in a depression tended through each generation by someone who understood its significance, and one generation that understood it only as the family home, which was its own form of understanding. By 1954, it was weathered in the way that structures genuinely used for 90 years are weathered, not decrepit, but marked, carrying its history in the grain of the logs and the particular solidity of the subfloor, which bore the weight of those who had been there and showed no sign of forgetting it. A historian from the State University came that summer, with a photographer having traced the provenance of the pamphlet back to the valley and the valley back to the cabin on the ridge. They were given access by Eric and Ingrid's granddaughter, a woman of 40, who had grown up in the cabin and who watched them photograph and measure and document with the patience of someone who has long since made peace with the fact that the thing they live in is also a piece of history that belongs in some sense to everyone. The historian pulled up the access panel to photograph the stone bed, which was intact, the same granite boulders Eric had selected from the creek bed in the autumn of 1867, still in position, still packed with the sand he had hauled from 3 miles distant, still carrying in their arrangement the precision of a ship's carpenter who had learned to measure for stress and not for appearance. The photographer set up her light and shot the stones from 3 angles, and then sat back on her heels and placed her bare palm flat against the uppermost layer, the way Carver had placed his palm against the floor 87 years before. The granddaughter was watching from the doorway. The historian was making notes. The photographer said nothing for a moment, and then her voice carried the particular quality of someone reporting something that doesn't fit the framework they brought to the room. "They're still warm." No one answered immediately. The historian looked up from his notes. The granddaughter looked at the open floor and the stones below and at the photographer's hand, and she thought about the answer, which was both simple and not simple at all, about what it meant that stone remembered fire across decades that a principal learned in a Minnesota back room and carried west by a man with an axe and a notebook had pressed itself so deeply into granite that it was still giving back warmth 3 generations later. She thought about all of this in the space of a few seconds, and then she gave the only answer that was equal to the question. "They always are."